What do you know about Washington's Black history?
I try to explore some of this history that's in front of people's faces, but they don't know what it is.
Like the first tell-all book about life inside the White House written by a slave.
His journey from slavery to freedom played out in the highest circles of ideas and power.
Or how about this flash from the past?
Along the banks of the Potomac River, where the cherry trees are today, used to be a bustling slave market.
And the surprising Black history of some of D.C.'s best-known neighborhoods.
There are still some examples of the Black presence in Georgetown. You just have to know where to look.
Black history is American history, and American history is Black history.
Up next, find out how the dream began here.
It's the symbol of American government, the U.S. Capitol, a familiar sight. But like many famous landmarks in our city, it has a surprising past. Find out how the dream began here as we uncover a Black history of Washington few people know.
Author Jesse Holland's book is filled with stories of early Black life in the District of Columbia.
Black men built the nation's capital. Where did they come from?
Around 400 African American slaves were used in the construction of the Capitol and the White House. They weren't owned by the government, but they rented them, and the government basically took care of them. The slave owners only had to provide the slave and a blanket. The government provided everything else and gave the slave owner all of the money.
And what kind of work did they do?
They did all of the brute labor that was needed to be done for the Capitol. Putting the stones in, cutting down trees, polishing marble. They did a lot of the hands-on work to actually put the walls up of the Capitol. One of the great things about going through the Capitol is that you can actually put your hands on some of the things that African American slaves touched. Inside Statuary Hall are these ornate marble columns. These columns came from a slave-operated marble quarry. So all of the columns, when you walk through that room, were at one point dug out of the ground, carved, and placed there by African American slaves. Every time I go through the Capitol, I make sure I touch at least one of those columns because there's a connection to what African American slaves did when they were working on the U.S. Capitol.
Every year, thousands of tourists and locals crowd the tidal basin to enjoy the fleeting beauty of the cherry blossoms. And there is Black history here, too.
What a lot of people don't know is along those same banks of the Potomac River used to be a bustling slave market. Slaves would be sold from there across the river into Alexandria, was one of the largest slave trading cities in the United States. When we're walking through those beautiful cherry blossoms every spring, you can't help but think about those African American slaves whose lives are being changed by being sold as property there on the banks of the U.S. Capitol.
Away from the mall and across the Potomac, you can explore Black history in Arlington National Cemetery. Once dominated by Robert E. Lee's mansion home, this landscape was overtaken by the Union when Lee left to command the Confederacy.
They decide that they're going to split up his land, and they actually give some to some of his African American slaves who create their own city called Freedmen's Village. It has houses, it has its own schools, it has its own churches, it even has its own hospital. After the Civil War ends, basically the inhabitants of Freedmen's Village are given 90 days to clear out everything. And the U.S. government tears down the entire village. Today, there's nothing left of Freedmen's Village, except one thing. There's one whole section of the cemetery where there are nothing but African American slaves buried. Those famous white tombstones of Arlington, all will say either citizen or civilian, because at the time of these slaves' death, they were freed and they were citizens of the United States of America.
Today, we call it the White House, but in the early years of the Republic, it was known as the Executive Mansion. Built with slave labor, it was staffed by slaves as well.
The slaves would work in the kitchens, which were also downstairs, and they would live downstairs. Of course, now, all of these same rooms are now used for a lot of different purposes. One of them is now the Blue Room, and one of them is now the Treaty Room.
Up next on The Dream Began Here, we return to the president's house, where a slave tells all.
It has been decreed by the White House Historical Association to be the first White House memoir.
The early years of the White House were often unsettled. 8 of the first presidents would bring slaves here. Even the father of the Constitution, James Madison. One of his slaves would grow up to write the first tell-all book about life inside the Executive Mansion. A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison tells the intriguing story of Paul Jennings.
His journey from slavery to freedom played out in the highest circles of ideas and power.
Once the director of education at Madison's Montpelier mansion, Elizabeth Dowling Smith was familiar with Jennings' writings.
It was more about the so-called great man than about Paul Jennings, but my interest was in finding out more about Paul Jennings himself.
Certainly, one of the most exciting chapters in Jennings' story tells about a memorable day during the War of 1812. On August 24, 1814, Madison was at the battlefront just 10 miles from the White House.
And when it was clear that the American militia could not hold back the British, he got word to Dolly at the White House to clear out. Well, Dolly was there with Paul Jennings, and indeed she gathered some White House treasures, jumped into her carriage. But before she did, she instructed Jennings to rescue the portrait of George Washington. Now, this portrait is enormous, 95 inches high. That's much bigger than the real-life 6'3" George Washington himself. And it took much effort to remove it from the wall, and rather miraculously, it was carried away into safety. And to this day, it hangs in the White House in the East Room.
Jennings returned with the family to Virginia. Back home, he was promoted to Madison's manservant and spent many hours with famous visitors in Montpelier's drawing rooms. When James Madison died in 1836, it threw his family and the slaves at Montpelier into turmoil.
Madison had bequeathed his slaves to his widow, but there is evidence that there was an understanding that Dolly then would free the slaves in her will. But as time went by, Jennings had reason to doubt that this would ever come to pass. Now that's because in 1844, Dolly Madison sold Montpelier and moved back to Washington.
Back in Washington, Paul Jennings once again found himself working at the White House.
Dolly at this time was in financial straits herself, and she had hired out Paul to President James Polk. Dolly, however, kept his wages.
She also set the price for his freedom at a low $200. But that was more than Jennings could afford, so he went to an old acquaintance from his days in Madison's parlors, Daniel Webster.
Even for a slave, it helps to have acquaintances in high places. And Jennings knew that Webster had helped out other slaves in need, and Webster did come to his rescue. So the deal that they struck was that Jennings would work off this debt by being an employee in Webster's house. Dolly Madison, in her last years, though she was like a queen dowager living a block away from the White House, very much in social demand, and considered a living icon of the generation of the Founding Fathers. But financially, she sometimes lacked even for the necessities of a household. And Webster instructed Jennings to bring Dolly baskets full of provisions, which he did, but he also gave her small sums of money from his own pocket.
When Webster died in 1852, Paul Jennings became a free man, but even his new status would not exempt him from Washington's Black Code.
Free blacks could not, according to this code, be out on the streets after 10 p.m. If they wanted to have any kind of gathering, even in a private home, they had to obtain a license.
He wrote his memoir in 1863. 2 years later, it was released as a book. Despite the success of an earlier slave tale, Solomon Northup's 12 Years as a Slave, Jennings' book remained largely unread.
In Jennings' case, there weren't but on the order of maybe 150 copies to begin with. So what's remarkable is not that it didn't get more play, but that it didn't fall into obscurity altogether.
Dowling Taylor hopes her work will renew interest in Paul Jennings and his remarkable life.
His journey from slavery to freedom, the way that it took place in the highest circles of ideas and power, it is a one-of-a-kind story. On the other hand, Paul Jennings is representative of many other African Americans of his time, whose stories perhaps never will be told.
Explore the hidden Black history of Foggy Bottom When the Dream Began Here continues.
Even today here in Foggy Bottom, we think that this has always been a white community because we've wiped out that black history of Foggy Bottom for the last 345 years.
George Washington University's professor, Bernard Demchuk, spearheads a project called Walking the Spirit of Foggy Bottom. As he leads his tours, he calls on the area's ancestors.
We're trying to understand that the ancestors have something to teach us because they're here all the time. Today, if you look around, you would never imagine that Foggy Bottom was African American primarily. The reason that Foggy Bottom was a predominantly black community is because of the ports of Georgetown, Foggy Bottom, and the southwest waterfront. That in fact is where African Americans came in the 1740s and 50s as enslaved persons to clear this area for tobacco plantations. From the 1740s to 1750s, places like Georgetown, Foggy Bottom, and Alexandria were really known as Port Tobacco. We are at the corner of 22nd and H on the George Washington University campus, and we are standing on the site of an Underground Railroad station stop. This was the home of Leonard Grimes. Leonard Grimes was a free black man who lived on this corner and had a transportation business. He had a horse and buggy, and he rode white people around the city as a taxi driver. What Mr. Grimes was doing at nighttime was using his horse and buggy to transport runaway slaves from Virginia to Baltimore. In 1846, he got caught and he was thrown in jail for 2 years. When he came out of jail, his house and his business was destroyed by the pro-slavery forces in the District of Columbia, and he was forced to leave and go to Boston.
Surprisingly, freed blacks like Leonard Grimes were not so rare here in the early 1800s. They achieved freedom in a variety of ways, buying it, running away, or being released when their masters died. Early census information from the District of Columbia reveals some interesting statistics.
So you had 20% of the black population here free in 1800. By 1830, abolition of slavery was so strong that a full 50% of the black people in DC were free. By 1860, right before the Civil War, 90% of the black people in DC were free, only 3,100 were enslaved.
Founded in 1868, St. Mary's Episcopal Church at the corner of 23rd and H Streets stands as a reminder of Black Foggy Bottom.
It used to be called St. Mary's Chapel for Colored Citizens. During the 1840s and 50s, at the height of the abolition movement, African Americans were demanding more dignity, more freedoms, and more opportunities for themselves, African Americans would have to sit in the back of the church or sit up in the balcony in order to worship in white churches. And starting certainly in the early 1800s, the black church really becomes the precursor of the modern civil rights movement, because it's where people could think and they could sit and they could reflect and they could organize and they could read and learn without being disrupted. So we're here now on 25th Street down in the very historic section of Foggy Bottom. And you can see these beautiful little homes here. These homes actually were the homes of industrial workers who worked in all the industries down there by Watergate. Glass factory, oil refineries, artisan shops, and most of this was African Americans. Behind them are all these little alleys. And the alleys, as you can see from Queen Anne's Court and Snow's Lane, these were all alleys that were occupied by African Americans looking for an opportunity to live in Washington, D.C. And these were the really slums of Washington. And poor people moved here, lived here until they could find a job and find a place to live.
Generations of blacks attended Thaddeus Stevens Elementary School in Foggy Bottom. Endowed by the Pennsylvania congressman in 1868 to educate newly emancipated youngsters, its doors were finally closed 140 years later.
And it became, for 100 years, the premier black elementary school in Washington, D.C. Naturally, it's located in Foggy Bottom. Naturally, it's located in a black community. Similar to the black church, the black school was the center of the universe for African Americans. Well, the black church was the first place that they got education, and then as they built their own schools and developed education, education was really the ticket to freedom, was the ticket to liberation, as it is today. We are trying in Washington, D.C. to get people to understand that African American history is all over this city. It's deep, it's rich, and it's extensive.
Coming up on The Dream Began Here, remembering the black history of Georgetown.
Slavery ended here in the District of Columbia before the Emancipation Proclamation and before the 13th Amendment. And by doing so, it became a magnet for freedom-seeking black folk coming from Maryland and Virginia and points beyond.
In 1989, the documentary Black Georgetown Remembered shared stories about the early days of the black community in this Western Washington neighborhood.
Was a native Virginian.
The Georgetown community has a long and rich history, and the achievements of its black residents are a central part of that history.
People really felt that their story hadn't been told up to that point, and Black Georgetown Remembered really is the first modern history of the African American community in Georgetown.
The documentary inspired a book with the same name. C.R. Gibbs worked on both. Today he lectures about the little-known black history of Georgetown.
Not a lot of people knew that blacks had lived here in the numbers that they did. And so this was another example of a part of the history of the city that is largely overlooked.
Back in its earliest days, Georgetown was part of Maryland, and it was geography that made it a magnet for blacks.
It was a bustling, successful port, and many African American men found jobs along the docks and warehouses on the banks of the river.
Up from the river, Georgetown's Herring Hill, named for the fish locals caught in the nearby Rock Creek, was a thriving black community.
Nearly 1,000 African Americans lived here, about 951. From the 1860s to the 1930s, while the African Americans that lived in locations like Herring Hill were never really rich, what they were is they had a wonderful, inspirational sense of community.
This Georgetown landmark pays testimony to the success many blacks achieved here. The home of one-time real estate magnate Alfred Pope sits at the corner of 29th and O Streets.
Mr. Pope rose from being an enslaved worker for a Southern congressman and became through dint of sheer effort. I mean, he was a rag man. If there was any job that could be done, Mr. Pope was not above doing it. He slowly, painfully amassed a fortune with which he did great good.
Much of that good benefited the Mount Zion Church down the street.
It is still the oldest African-American congregation in the city. The one, dare I say, permanent reminder of the presence of the African-American community in the town of George still remains in the churches. And so when black folk come on Sunday, the newer residents are surprised to see the black folks coming into this neighborhood, but that's a reminder of a legacy that not as many people know about as should.
Mount Zion Church Cemetery is one place where visitors can still catch a glimpse of Georgetown's vanishing black history.
Mount Zion Cemetery is the final resting place for many of Georgetown's African-American elite, as well as members of the working class. And so in its confines, we have the story of an African-American community that some of the graves go back well before freedom came to the nation's capital. Mount Zion Cemetery is also famous for being a stop on the Underground Railroad. We believe the burial vault was a place in which people who had been enslaved might be kept overnight or perhaps even longer until they could be smuggled down the hill to the waterfront and then on board a waiting vessel to take them to freedom. There are still some examples of the black presence in Georgetown. You just have to know where to look.
We've only skimmed the surface of Black history here in DC. You can find many more links on our website, dc50tv.com. We hope you have enjoyed learning about the tribulations and triumphs, and that you share with us in the pride that the dream began here.